First of all, thank you, Sansia, for all of your help and leadership, to everybody at Compass and to our entire Compass team. And a special thanks to Marvin Rosen, our board member, who's our Compass guru. So before we dive into the conversations today, I just wanted to bring everyone up to date on some of the work that we've been doing here at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, especially around COVID and racial justice. Before I begin, a special thanks to Mike and Jim and David for leading us in what will be a wonderful discussion in just a few minutes. At RFK Human Rights, everything we do begins with my father's values and vision. And on April 4th, 1968, he addressed what was a majority Black audience in downtown Indianapolis. And he had to tell them the dreadful news that Martin Luther King had been killed. That night, riots broke out in 125 cities across the United States, and Dover, Delaware was under martial law for the next 9 months. The next day, the white establishment immediately reacted by saying they now, because of the looting, they owed nothing to the Black community. And so my father wanted to challenge that notion, and he gave a speech at the Cleveland City Club, which was a bastion of white power. And in that speech, he said that the structures of power upon which these men sat were built on institutions of the anti-Black racism, and that riots were the inevitable outcome of structural racism, and that they had a duty to dismantle structural racism in our country. I just want to show you a 2-minute clip from that speech. But before we show the clip, I just want to say there have been a lot of showings and reshowings of anti-Black violence in the last few months. If that's hard for you to watch, then you might not want to watch this video, because it's tough.
Whenever any American's life is taken unnecessarily, whether it is done in the name of the law or in defiance of the law, whenever we do this, then the whole nation is degraded. And yet it goes on and on and on in this country of ours. Too often we excuse those who are willing to build their own lives on the shattered dreams of other human beings. Some accuse others of rioting and inciting riots have by their own conduct invited them. This is the violence of institutions, indifference, inaction, and decay. This is the violence that afflicts the poor, that poisons relations between men because their skin has different colors. This is the slow destruction of a child by hunger and schools without books. This is the breaking of a man's spirit by denying him the chance to stand as a father and as a man amongst other men. We learn at the last to look at our brothers as alien. For when you teach a man to hate and to fear his brother, when you teach that he is a lesser man because of his color, then you also learn to confront others, not as fellow citizens, but as enemies. To be met not with cooperation, but with conquest. To be subjugated and to be mastered. We learn to share only a common fear, only a common impulse, to meet disagreement with force. But this much is clear. Violence breeds violence, repression breeds retaliation, and only a cleansing of our whole society can remove this sickness from our souls. We must admit the vanity of our false distinctions and learn to find our own advancement in search for the advancement of all.
Thank you. You know, that video reminds us that although there are many things that have changed over the last 50 years, there are still extraordinary human rights challenges in our country that we have yet to address. And that's really around institutional racism. We have deep anti-Black racial divisions that we've never addressed, from police violence to the criminal legal system, to the system of financial inclusion, exclusion, and the other structures that are underlying the social and economic conditions that allow racism to persist. We have this against the backdrop of a global pandemic, which disproportionately impacts communities of color and deepens wealth inequality in our country and around the world. And then we have the Trump administration unleashing military and police on protesters, on peaceful protesters, and sending a clear endorsement of anti-Black violence domestically, while signaling to oppressive regimes across the world that it is okay to use military force against peaceful protesters, to countries like China and Hong Kong, Myanmar military against the Rohingya, and the Venezuelan military against the indigenous populations of the Amazon. So just as my father worked to address these issues in our country and around the world, that's what RFK Human Rights is doing today, and that's what the Compass program is ultimately all about. The core of our domestic work is around criminal legal system reform, and our approach is very simple. It's first to listen and be educated by the people who are on the front lines, because we believe that those closest to the problems are closest to the solution. So we are working across the country with Black-led organizations on police violence and criminal justice reform. Many of the people who we work with are formerly incarcerated or have deep personal engagements on these issues. And we are working with frontline advocates to end money bail, to decarcerate local jails, and to roll back mass incarceration. So what do we do? For instance, during COVID, we partnered with local bail funds who are doing this work day in and day out across the country. We orchestrated 12 bailouts of people whose lives were at risk of COVID that were rampaging through jails. An example, we bailed out one woman who was put in jail and had $25 in bail that she could not pay for unpaid parking tickets, and her life was at risk. That's what we are doing in this country to people. We bailed out over 100 people. And this is so important today, because if you take a map of the jails and prisons in the United States and you superimpose that on a map of where the biggest outbreaks of COVID are coming from, they are exactly the same map. So we're doing that on one side. On the other side, we're supporting young leaders in classrooms and college campuses across our country to become human rights defenders in their own communities through our education program called Speak Truth to Power. We've established a Young Leaders Defenders Fund and series of guidance to support young leaders to engage in protests against police violence in their communities. And I'm so proud to say that one of our groups of young leaders at Texas State just helped local advocates pass the first cite and release law in the state of Texas to ensure that whole categories of people will no longer see jail time and instead will just receive a notice of when they need to appear in court. And then, of course, we work with the investment community to drive towards racial equity. As you know, across the $70 trillion worldwide investment industry, less than 2% of funds go to women and minority-owned firms. And under Marvin's leadership, RFK Compass is working with John Rogers and Mike Posner and our partners at NYU to address this disparity and people in the Compass community. We are convening leaders at the universities with the largest and with the 30 largest endowments in the United States to redirect their investments consistently with their diversity values. We are urging the investment world to use income inequality as the universal measurement of the S in ESG. Next, we're in discussion with leaders in the investment sectors about concrete steps they can take to address racial and economic justice. In the United States today, the racial wealth gap is staggering. Median household wealth for a Black family in our country is $17,000. Median household wealth for a white family is $171,000, 10 times as much. That is unacceptable. And the investment community can do a lot to address that. Last Thursday, together with 128 socially responsible investors, we issued an investor solidarity statement on racial injustice. And it was picked up by Bloomberg and Barron's. And we give people specific things that they can do. Later this week, we are issuing our 5-point action plan for investors to address racial justice in this sector. And we urge you to really take a look at that and to spread it far and wide within your community. I'll just give you a couple of examples of the types of things we're urging people to do. One is screen out companies in your portfolio whose business models, products, and practices actively support the racist criminal legal system, such as supporting predatory lenders and private prisons. 2, offer paid time off with healthcare coverage to contract and part-time workers who are essential to business operations. 3, challenge portfolio companies to place 5 Black leaders on their boards over the next 12 months. And 4, invest in community development financial institutions owned by Black, Native American, and Indigenous groups. And I just have to say that for me, this last one is especially important, personally to me, because my dad, Bobby Kennedy, started the first community development bank in the United States at Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, which was one of the largest slums in America in the 1960s. And that organization continues to this day. So if you're trying to figure out which one to invest in Bed-Stuy. Meanwhile, our day-to-day work protecting and honoring journalists and working on international human rights continues. So we are doing all this work. I'm happy to say that our seminal report on the systemic use of disappearances and extrajudicial executions by the Maduro regime in Venezuela was the front page above the fold of the New York Times international section day before yesterday. And we're working on cases across the globe. Our work is possible because of your support. So I want to thank you all again for being part of the Compass community, for donating your time and through your wallets and making this possible. Look forward to today's conversation. And if you want to become more engaged in our work on social justice and racial justice, we're looking for partners. We're looking for help. So please get in touch with me or Sansia or Marvin, and we will get you engaged with us. Thank you so much, and thanks again for your support. Okay, Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's unfortunate that today was the day we were supposed to be in Hyannisport, But at least through technology, we can address some of these issues, at least over Zoom. So with that, before we tackle some of the topics that Carrie mentioned, first, I want to check in with Jim and David. It's been an interesting few months. We have a global pandemic. The world has been shut down, reopened. The waves are going around the world. We're all starting to work from home, or we've been working from home for a while. But in the meantime, the investment process must still happen, right? We're all still fiduciaries. We're all overlooking pools of capital on behalf of ourselves and our constituents. I think before we get into the meat of the discussion, I would check in with each of you first and say, well, how are you? How are you doing working from home? And how's the process working on your end? And I guess I'll just go to you first, David, because it's alphabetical.
Yeah, Mike, thanks. So we're probably, like most folks, counting by the week. I mean, we're in week 14 working remotely. And I would say, like, for the New York City retirement systems, our private equity team consists of 6 professionals. And I would sort of describe it as we haven't really missed a beat. And I think it's because the team has taken the approach of kind of leaning into the workload, I don't know, 115, 120%, kind of over communicating internally, because precisely since we're not in the office and the information flow is less fluid, we're doing simple things like, like most folks, doing weekly update calls, but also copying everyone on the team in communications where sometimes it would just be the coverage team for a specific GP relationship. But in the wake of the COVID crisis and going remotely, we find that kind of making the effort to get the information to everybody, just kind of helped us work better together. So I think we're, on track. I think we've been just as effective in executing on fund commitments and strategic initiatives remotely as we would have if we were in person.
Jim?
Thanks, Mike. But firstly, I might mention that anything we talk about pales compared to Carrie's wonderful introduction, raising huge issues, which, although we're in Canada, are obviously relevant to us as well. But that was a wonderful start. It just occurs to me that when we talk about challenges of working remotely, that I should probably mention to people that some context in terms of the Canadian model, because there's quite a difference between Canada and the United States in the work we do as private equity groups. The Canadian model has been to build teams inside these pension organizations that, in some cases, in one case in Canada, the group does only direct investing, so they act entirely as a private equity fund. In our case, our team has decided strategically that we'll do both. So we have part of our business making fund commitments and part of our business investing directly, just as a private equity fund does. And some of our investments are around the world, some are in the United States. A couple of them would be known to you. So we have both types of work going on. And because of that, working remotely is working just fine from the perspective of making fund commitments, but it's a little more difficult in doing direct transactions. We have a couple on right now, one of which is a business that the head office is in Seattle. They've got part of their operations in Alaska, another in the Midwest of the United States. One of our large investments, the multi-billion-dollar investment, has a head office that we moved to Boulder, Colorado. Although I initiated that move and we've set up a management team down there, I haven't yet been able to visit the office. And in doing due diligence, we were just on a group call this morning about how difficult it is to do what we'd normally do, which is go to other people's offices, go to their manufacturing facilities, and just get a better sense of the business that way. So there's no doubt that that part of our business is more challenging.
So Jim, that brings up a good point. Obviously, usually if I think back to the GFC, this is where we would normally talk about the denominator effect, how it's impacting portfolio construction. If you look at the public markets, miraculously, there is no denominator effect. And people, and I have to give credit to the LPs this time around, most of them manage their capital well. They didn't get ahead of their skis from a cash flow perspective, with the exception of maybe some smaller endowments and foundations that have, I would say their issue is more a revenue problem than an actual denominator effect problem. But is your pacing still on track? Are you changing your portfolio construction? Are you looking at, I mean, everyone talks about the haves and have-nots because it's hard to do an investment that you haven't met with someone. And maybe I'll toss this at you first, David, and then I'll come back to you, Jim. How are you thinking about that pacing and investment process when you are clearly stuck in your house and so are the rest of us?
Yeah, I think, I think back to the first 2 or 3 weeks when we went remote, kind of call it mid-March till the end of, or into early April. And we were a little bit in like crisis management mode because, as we all recall, the public markets were showing like signs of extreme downward volatility going into the end of the first quarter. So if we go back that period of time, no one expected really the swift, kind of equity market rally that we're seeing today. So in that initial period, we worked with our private equity consultants to run a series of kind of scenarios and pacing analysis precisely to kind of be as thoughtful as we could. And I think where we are shaking out is we are more or less on track to pace in our 2020 commitments, similar to a similar range where we were when the boards approved our pacing plans in the fourth quarter of 2019. So I think we're kind of on track. And the way New York City is approaching it, which I think is, was a strategic shift and a lesson learned from the global financial crisis is, we have a pacing target and sort of a zone or a band of private equity exposure, where our trustees are comfortable and where we can be investing. So it's not like there's one hard number where, if the public markets have a decline, it automatically triggers, the need for a secondary sale or some sort of, massive rebalancing.